This is the instructor's video for Chapter 26, Affluence and Anxiety in the Atomic Age. This chapter deals with the time period of the 1950s, and it begins with a conversation about President Eisenhower and politics in the 50s. President Eisenhower was president through much of the 1950s, and he was what they called a middle-of-the-road politician, meaning that his political ideas fell pretty much right between Democrats and Republicans. And this was a good time for a middle-of-the-road politician because it was a time of consensus politics when many Americans generally agreed on certain things. They agreed on the need to win the Cold War without preferably engaging in an actual hot war. They agreed that they wanted to keep the major programs of the New Deal intact, and of course everyone agreed that they wanted to see the economy prosper. And they certainly got their wish in terms of the economy. The post-war period, so after World War II until about the 1960, it was a period of solid economic growth. Consumerism surged because there was pent-up demand during the Great Depression. So in the 1930s, people didn't have the money to buy things. During World War II, things were not being produced for consumer purchase. And in the 1950s, Americans had the money and the products were being produced. So Americans were shopping and consuming. So you can see in this chart that per capita income roughly doubled from $1,500 a year to about $3,000 a year. And the gross national product, how much the economy was producing, nearly tripled. Home ownership in suburbia expanded, and African Americans continued to move north and west into the cities from the countryside. In terms of gender and family, the traditional family was idealized in television and the print media. But 30% of the workforce were women. And here we can see a nuclear family as dad is coming home from work and mom's been home with the kids, and they're in the suburbs. The baby boom also proceeded, reaching its height in the second half of the 1950s. And much like consumerism, Americans had put off having babies. During the Depression, they didn't have enough money, and then they did begin during World War II, but after the war, they had the money, they had the homes, and they had put it off. So the number of children per family nearly doubled in the 1950s from what it had been in the 1920s. Although the 50s were a decade of prosperity, there were still problems, and there were also deep criticisms of the culture of the 50s. Chronic poverty was still a problem. 1/4 of Americans were in poverty, and half of African Americans were in poverty. So that prosperity did not spread equally. There were also deep criticisms of mainstream culture. In particular, they criticized the tendency for consensus, for everybody to agree. Critics of the 1950s said there's no diversity, everybody's all alike, you can't express a unique opinion. So a counterculture called the Beats emerged, which really emphasized self-expression, being yourself, doing your own thing. Rock and roll music also popularized as it ran counter to mainstream culture. It was both an interracial musical style, but also we see some kind of seeds of the sexual revolution here as well. So teens, of course, in particular, were enjoying rock and roll. In the 1950s, we have the earliest years of the civil rights movement. President Eisenhower followed mainstream beliefs around race, and most Americans, it was part of the consensus, most Americans agreed that there should be a slow civil rights movement to create eventual equality. African Americans were expanding their challenges to inequality, only they wanted to see a quicker movement. There was a victory with Brown versus the Board of Education in 1952, and of course your textbook describes this. This is a Supreme Court decision that overturned separate but equal. In other words, it set a precedent to end segregation throughout the South. The textbook describes several of the nonviolent civil disobedience actions of the early civil rights movement. So nonviolent civil disobedience means that they were willing to break the law. So civil disobedience, you will break the law, but they were doing it for what they saw as a higher purpose. And you did it in a nonviolent way. So, for instance, by breaking the law, I don't mean stealing or hurting people. What I mean is the law required, for instance, African Americans to sit in the back of the bus. So in this image, we see Martin Luther King on the left, and you can see him sitting in the front. So simply by sitting there, he is breaking the law, and he's doing it, of course, in a nonviolent way. The early civil rights movement focused on ending segregation, particularly on integrating schools. And Martin Luther King, who we see here in the image, came to the limelight in the early or mid-1950s. And finally, the textbook deals with foreign policy. Eisenhower continued to try to contain communism, but also began to talk about rolling it back or pushing communists back. He was willing to use the threat of nuclear war to gain his objectives. The CIA continued its work in espionage or spying, and in secretly engaging in foreign nations. The textbook also describes the beginning of the U.S. involvement in Vietnam and American actions in Hungary and Egypt. In the Middle East, Eisenhower pledged to help any nation there avoid communism. Finally, the chapter concludes with an assessment of Eisenhower's presidency. Thank you for listening.